Welcome back to Flight Education. Today we'll be exploring some more geometry, specifically the different types of triangles and their properties. But before we look at those, there are two more types of angles that we need to discuss. An acute angle is an angle that is smaller than a right angle. So if you remember, this is a right angle, and by the way, it's usually designated by a little box just so you can be sure it's a right angle. And so an acute angle is any angle that is smaller than a right angle. So here we can see that these two sides are closer together, so that makes it an acute angle because the angle is smaller than the right angle. An obtuse angle, on the other hand, is an angle that's bigger than a right angle. So these two sides are much further apart than in this case, or in this case. So that makes this an obtuse angle because it's bigger than that 90-degree angle. So there are actually two different ways we can classify different triangles. So one of the ways is by the angles of the triangle, and then the other way is by the side lengths of the triangle. So let's look at the first way of classifying different triangles. So here we see that an acute triangle is when all angles are acute. So here in this triangle, we can see that all of these angles are smaller than that right angle. That makes this an acute triangle. Here we have a right triangle, and what makes a right triangle is that it has one right angle. So this angle right here is designated by that box. So that's how we know it's 90 degrees, and you can just tell by looking that it looks like it's 90 degrees. So that makes this a right triangle. An obtuse triangle has one obtuse angle. So that means that this angle is bigger than the right angle, which we can see is the case because these two sides are really wide apart as compared to here or here. So that makes this an obtuse angle, which makes the whole triangle obtuse. The other way we can classify different triangles is by their side lengths. So the first type of triangle is called an equilateral triangle. And an equilateral triangle has three congruent sides, or three sides with the same length. So we can see here, this is a triangle with side lengths 3, 3, and 3. And since all the sides are the same length, that makes this an equilateral triangle. An isosceles triangle, that's how you pronounce this word, it's a little bit complicated, has two congruent sides. So this triangle has side lengths 5, 5, and 2. So these two sides, the 5 and the 5, are the same length. So that makes this an isosceles triangle because that means those sides are congruent. And then lastly, we have scalene triangles, which are triangles with no congruent sides. That means all the side lengths are different numbers. So here we have 3, 4, and 6. None of these side lengths are the same, so that means there are no congruent sides, making this a scalene triangle. And since there are two different ways of classifying triangles, every triangle will fall under one of those two different ways of classifying. So I'll show you what that means. So let's look at some examples. So here we have three different triangles, and each of these triangles can be classified in two ways, by their angles and by their side lengths. So let's look at those different ways. So the first triangle we see has side lengths of 3, 4, and 5. So that means that it's a scalene triangle because there's no congruent sides. None of these side lengths are the same. And we can also see that it has one right angle as shown by the box, and because you can tell by how it looks that this is a right angle. So that makes this triangle a scalene right triangle. So it's a scalene triangle as well as a right triangle. Now let's look at this example. So this triangle we see has side lengths of 3, 3, and 3. And if we remember, an equilateral triangle also has three congruent sides, or three sides with the same length. So that makes this an equilateral triangle. And then if we look at the angles, we see that these are all smaller than a right angle. So that makes this an equilateral acute triangle. And if we look at our last example, we see that we have side length 5, side length 5, and side length 8. So that means there are two congruent sides, or two sides of the same length. That makes this an isosceles triangle. And then if we look at the angle, we can see that this angle is really wide. It's wider than a right angle, or it's wider than 90 degrees because these two sides are pretty far apart. So that makes this an obtuse triangle, and since there are two congruent sides, it's also an isosceles triangle. So it's an isosceles and an obtuse triangle. So that's going to be it for today's lesson. We have some helpful worksheets in the description below for you to practice what you've learned, and there's also a link to our website, which has more worksheets on other subjects. Also, don't forget to subscribe and check out our channel to see more videos like these. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.